Triumph motorcycles. We're going to chat about where they came from, where they're at today. And Terry actually knows quite a bit about Triumph motorcycles. He sells them for a living. So we're going to do a little bit of history on them and see how that ties into the models we got now. So, where do we start? 1889. It was a nice summer day, the breeze was in the air, and two buddies decided to build bicycles. And they called it the Triumph Cycle Company. And started making pedal bikes in England. And then these two guys made these bikes for quite a while, and then as motors were starting to be a thing and motor bikes were starting to be a thing, they put a motor on one of their pedal bikes for the first time in 1902.
Making it a motorcycle.
Yay! And
imagine that.
And this is 120 years ago for the people who can't do math. So in 1902, they made their first motorcycle, and they have been continuously making motorcycles since then, making them the brand that has been producing motorcycles continuously for the longest in history.
They're doing good. They've had some different owners throughout the years and different things, but the brand has been around as Triumph, as motorcycles since 1902, which is pretty rad.
Yeah.
1 year older than anybody else. Continuously.
Yes, continuously. Yeah. Cool fun fact too, they have been British owned since 1902.
That's true.
They are also British owned today.
That is very true.
Oh, Muppets on Facebook thinking you're bad, mate. I'll line every last one of your birds up on bum.
The early days were rudimentary bikes, kind of like everything was. They weren't necessarily cutting edge. And then they were in England when they went through the First World War, when they went through the Second World War. Some of their manufacturing efforts during the Second World War, more because they had built a bigger plant in 1940, went towards the war effort as well. So they produced less. But in 1949, Triumph came to play. They came with the Thunderbird 650. So the Thunderbird brand of Triumph bikes, and it was considered the first super bike ever to be produced. This was a bike that had performance in mind, and only performance in mind, and it came from the minds of Triumph.
It was cool. I mean, they used that name until just very recently. They've had a Thunderbird bike, and they don't anymore, but I mean, they're Triumph, so they'll come back with one pretty soon.
Yeah.
It's a pretty famous motorcycle name.
And the cool thing with that is, in all their history, the names are really relevant and they come back throughout the entire history. So in 1949, 1950s, this was the thing. This was the coolest bike that Triumph had. In the 1960s is where we saw the biggest boom for Triumph, especially on the North American market and in the States, when they brought out the Bonneville. The average guy that you talk to about Triumph today who hasn't been in the Triumph showroom thinks of a Bonneville. What he's picturing a Triumph to be is a Triumph Bonneville, 100%.
And most of their other bikes are kind of all based off that bike. Now, all their modern classics, the Scrambler, it's basically just a Bonneville that someone they turned back into more off-roading back in the day. The TT Racer, well, they just made it more forward. You just take a Bonneville and you can do anything with it. And now they have a bunch of bikes that started, back then when people were customizing these bikes, turning them into cafe racers, turning them into scramblers, turning them into brat bikes, bobbers, all of that stuff. It's all based really off that Bonneville bike originally, and it still is today.
Yeah, so if we were going to the modern showroom today, all the bikes Terry's just mentioned, so you have the regular Bonneville, you've got the Scrambler, which is the off-road Bonneville, you've got the Bobber, which is a bobber.
Bobbed out,
and then you've got the Cafe Racer is the what?
There's the Thruxton, which would be their Cafe Racer, basically.
Yeah, and then the other one that you mentioned.
The TT, so that's it could be a Thruxton with a cafe fairing on it as opposed to without a fairing. Yeah. I mean, it's all just customizing these old Triumphs. Basically getting one bike back in the 60s, when you had this one bike available, but it didn't suit your riding needs, so you changed the bike. You didn't go buy a Triumph Scrambler, you just made one. And that's kind of cool. And then now that's so synonymous with what the new bikes are that's already pre-built for you. But back then it was, you just took a Bonneville and changed it to whatever the heck you needed it to do. And that's what's so cool about it.
And that entire culture and the bikes we see today trace their lineage to those 60s and early 70s bikes from Triumph. And probably where anybody that is around today that has any nostalgia about Triumph is thinking of those bikes. We fast forward to 1973, which that's when they finally killed BSA, which was a sister company to Triumph. And then they decided, hey, we're just going to move forward with Triumph and we're going to drop BSA. So that was kind of a sad moment for motorcycle history. And then that's when the rough waters started for Triumph. In the late 70s and the early 80s, they lost their main manufacturer that they had built in 1940. That went away, it got destroyed. They were having money issues. The British government actually wrote off all their debts, which was kind of nice. Like the British people wanted Triumph to stay alive. It is super obvious. There was a backing from their own country to keep this brand alive, and it was on life support 1,000%. And then some rich dude bought it out in the 80s, and in the 90s, he brought it back. And he brought it back with some wicked cool bikes. He brought it back with probably the most known 90s Triumph, the Daytona.
Yeah, the Daytona, their triple engines, what they started doing in the 90s, the street triple with the dual headlights. I mean, all that stuff kind of started... the Trident, the old, like all these names started coming back in the 90s, and they're growing today. And right now they're still the fastest growing motorcycle brand still in this, like in the last couple of years. They're growing the most. I mean, everyone knows what a Triumph looks like. It looked good 50 years ago. It's going to look good 50 years from now.
Yeah.
As long as their classic bikes go, you know, and there's some cool factor too, back in the 60s, right? Like you were talking about, Steve McQueen.
Yeah.
Steve McQueen is the guy, the wild Marlon Brando, Wild Ones. He actually rode a Triumph. Not like it was, everybody thinks it's a Harley. No, he's riding a Triumph. Like back the post-war, in the States, everyone started riding Harleys, right? So that late 1940s in the States, the GIs, they learned how to fix these things over in Europe, and now they come home and there's a surplus, so they started riding Harleys. Well, same thing happened in Europe and in England. So all these guys coming home from the war, that's why it kind of became a cool thing. You had Triumph, in Europe across the pond, and you had Harley Davidson, and synonymously right in that era until they started getting issues in the 70s. Basically, was they were both considered the kind of the cool guy bike.
Yeah, and the 90s Triumphs were in a bunch of movies. Like if you think of the 90s high-end bike, like you would think of kind of Ducati today, that was the Triumph Daytona. That was the 90s cool bike. The bike you show up and this just demands attention. So now let's fast forward a little bit in the era of the stupid choppers. What did Triumph do? They went completely a different way in 2004, and I think you know the bike I'm talking about. You should take over this one because I think you know this bike. It was the biggest CC bike ever produced then, and it is still the biggest bike ever produced. That is not a stupid Boss Haas with a V8 in it. Yeah. This is an actual motorcycle, not a motor with a fucking seat on it.
It's the biggest production motorcycle of all time, and it's the Triumph Rocket.
3.
Rocket 3, because it's 3 cylinders, which is nuts. And everyone looks at it like, is that a V6? Because you only see the 3 sides, but that's just 3 cylinders, just really big. Right now, it's 2.5 liters, so that's 2,500 cc's on a production motorcycle. It is nuts. It has it's the most torque out of any motorcycle, production motorcycle, by far, like 160 foot-pounds of torque, something ridiculous, and about 160 horsepower too. So I mean, that thing rips.
It's got a bigger engine than 90% of the compact cars out there. It's insane.
It's got more horsepower than a Subaru, man.
Yeah,
like
it's got a bigger motor and more horsepower. They brought that out in 2004, and again, trying to find, I think. From 2010 to today is where Triumph came full circle, brought their identity back. So, I'm Jeremy, this is Terry with Pink Orange. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment,